Marvel recently announced that Robert Downey Jr. is returning to the MCU. Yeah! For all the money, I'm sure. But it did remind us of one of these moments from the 2015 Fantastic Four movie, which did have a great Forcefield bullet interaction effect. The Forcefield is an interesting effect that we've seen countless times across sci-fi and fantasy films in many different styles and uses, and all of them very cool. We've even done a version as well. We're gonna get to how we did the visual effects of the Forcefield in the second half of the episode, so if you just want to jump right into the After Effects tutorial, check the timestamps for that. But first, we needed our footage. We decided to stay in our office for this, so we threw some light bars up in the ceiling to give it a different feel, sending everything very orange with a hint of cyan and green here and there. But extending those lights down the hall gave us a nice bit of light and shadow for her to walk through. And the open window in the back gave more color contrast and a nice hot spot to start off. Then to add a little sci-fi light spill on her face, I had someone hold a small light set to a palish green. It's very subtle in the final shot, but you can see it's giving us a nice eye light here and just a small amount of contrasting fill, which, although not directly noticeable, does a lot. I also used my Ronin 4D so we could get silky smooth shots while technically staying handheld for speed, and I'm always interested in moving as fast as possible, which is why we use these haze cans instead of a hazer here as well. We could just spray and go. And honestly, that's where staying wireless and going with battery-powered everything as much as possible comes in. The less you have to plug things in, the faster you can move and stay creative, which brings me to today's partner, Smallrig. Recently, they've released some awesome new batteries, and I'm not usually one to get excited about batteries, but these are really legitimately cool. We have two V-mount batteries with the VB99 and the VB212, and these MP970 batteries. The MP970 batteries are incredibly universal, especially with things like monitors or lights. So if we need to go handheld with a light like we did in the shot here, we can toss this bad boy on and off we go. Now, this specific light that we use doesn't have that kind of mount and does have an internal battery, but this is where my favorite thing about this battery comes in, right here. You have a USB-C port right on the battery that can be used to power other devices. So even though this small MC light doesn't have the MP970 connection, if it were to die on me, I can connect right to its USB-C port and continue on. Which means you can do that with anything, your cell phone, iPad, and so on. And what is even cooler is that you can fast charge this thing using the USB-C port, which will go from 0% to 100 in 3.5 hours. You also have a USB-A port here for more charging options, and this battery has a 10,500 milliamp hour, 76.65 watt capacity. So you're getting something really solid there too. Another simple but important thing I love here is the LED readout, which gives us exactly where we are on the battery very quickly. And with this sort of battery, we can keep our handheld lights powered as needed and lets us do our takes over and over without needing to pause until we had the shots we needed. Jumping back into shooting the actual piece, the next thing up was to flip around to get Justin's shots here. First with the wide, then we moved in for the close-up with his first shot here. For the wide, I didn't like how the side of the hall looked for the one we were using with Emily, so we went to the other hall instead. And I don't think you can tell in the final sequence at all. But we did the same setup here, got our shots, and an extra thing we did here was to remove the actors out of the shot and place a light at the end that would represent the muzzle flash. So now we're getting correct real-world reflections from this light off the walls that we're going to be able to use later to sell the muzzle flash effect. Then we moved in close and did something similar. We have this Smallrig light here, which has this great flash setting. Then we put a flag in front of the light and removed it on cue. And this practical light does an insane amount in selling the moment. Originally, I did test doing it in the grade, and that looked truly horrible, so we grabbed the light and ended up with something that looked really great. If you don't have a light like this, you could do something similar with a can light or possibly a strobe light that you throw an orange gel on. We didn't have this specific light on a battery, but if we moved around at all, that would have been really helpful, similar to the light that we used to fill our actress when she was walking down the hall. Which again, the batteries I usually use for that sort of thing are annoyingly massive, like this one here. But these new Smallrig batteries are shockingly small while still being very powerful. I have have the VB99 and the VB212 here, and for what these things do, they are tiny. With the VB99, you have even more than what we're getting from the NP970. Like the NP970, you do have fast charging here and the USB-C and USB-A ports, but you do get a lot more. Obviously, we're getting more power, but you also have the V-mount connection, of course, but then you also get D-tap over here, and up top where you find the USB-C and USB-A, we also have DC power with a 12-volt and 8-volt output. You also have a few threaded spots for whatever mounting you need, one on the bottom and two on the back, and of course the LED readout. You're getting more here as well. You've got your battery percentage, of course, but then you're also able to monitor your connections that you have going and what voltage is being used, since you can connect multiple devices at once thanks to the parallel circuit design. And saving the biggest for last, we have the VB12, and as the name suggests, this one boasts a 212 watt-hour battery, which means you can output up to 212 watts at once. Like the 99, you have a locking I/O cover here, and underneath that cover you have the 12 and 8 volt DC connections, a USB-A and the USB-C connection, but the VB212 also has a second USB-C port. Both of the USB-C ports are 140 watt bidirectional USB-C 3.1 that can output up to 28 volts at 5 amps. Then you also have the D-tap on the side, a 6 amp connection here, and then a second D-tap on the other side that can output 10 amps. And of course the V-mount, which will give you 19 amps of draw. This one also charges fast at 0% to 100 in 2 hours, and something that is insanely cool is that you can charge this battery through the USB-C port while using it. So if you're powering a device of some kind and can't shut down for a swap, you still have an option to keep you shooting there. It would be a very rare occasion that you would need that, but it is still great to have. Up front, you have an impressive LED display with a ton of information. You get the percentage of the battery life, of course, a bolt underneath that which will show you when you're charging, and underneath that you get an estimate of how much time you have remaining on this battery given the output that you're using. To the left of that, you have some of the coolest stuff here. Once we plug in, you get a readout of each port and what it is doing. A green arrow pointing up indicates power going out, and a green arrow pointing down shows power coming in. You also get a readout of the watts that each port is using, and if you double click the power button, you can get that in volts instead. We can also plug in all of the things here. If I connect my laptop, a camera, a light, my iPad, and so on, we can get a reading for what the battery is sending to each of these right up front. And again, a readout of how long I can power all of these at once. Of course, you have great safety specs on all of these, 1500 safety tests, LG 2100 cells with battery management system, but it's the versatility of all three that send them to the top for me. These things can power anything any other V-mount can, but it also acts as a power brick for anything you need. All three of these were so well thought out and executed on that I'm going to be shifting to these as our main battery solution. And one thing that has always driven me nuts are the annoyingly large and expensive chargers these sorts of batteries need. So being able to charge them right from USB-C makes me ridiculously happy. And you can get any of these at 20% off until August 18th by using the code FilmRiot at any of the store links in our description. So if you do want to take a look at these for yourself, and you should, check them out in the links below. Unlimited ammo. But with all that, it's time to jump into After Effects. And for all of the shockwave impacts within this sequence, we're using assets from our Shockwaves pack. And if you have the Infinity pack, you're going to have the same shockwaves there as well. For this first shot, as the force field is created, we chose to use the Energy Ring shockwave asset and dropped it into a new comp. To create a matte inside of this, we're going to add a solid layer, and on a random frame in the middle, we'll use the pen tool to draw a shape matching the shockwave. Now we'll keyframe this to animate as the shockwave spreads, keeping it closely within the outline until we have a matching matte. Now duplicate this mask and set it to subtract, offset the keyframes, and boost the feather before keyframing this and the expansion to have the matte stay more solid in the center to begin with before fading and expanding outwards. For some reason, geometric shapes seem to be a common pattern design for these types of things, so we'll do something similar to add some extra details as the force field expands. So first, create a new solid and apply the grid effect, changing the size from to width slider. Increase the width to make the pattern larger, then the border for thickness, and check invert grid. Next, add the CC hex tile effect, changing render to fold aligned and increasing the radius to choose a pattern you like. And changing the grid width will also alter the design. Now we'll set this layer to screen and use the matte we drew as an alpha. Increase the matte mask 1 feather to soften the edges and keyframe if needed. We also wanted some extra pattern details around the border, so we'll duplicate both the grid and matte, and on the new version, change the grid width as well as the hex tile radius. If we solo, you can see changing the smearing value animates the pattern, so we'll add some keyframes throughout the shot to get an animation which gradually gets slower as it expands. Unsoloed, we can see both patterns are too bright at the start, so we'll keyframe the first grid opacity to fade at the start, leaving only the second grid visible until it expands. To keep the second grid closer to the border on the duplicate matte layer, we'll remove the mask to expansion, feather keyframes, and change the values, limiting the second grid to just around the edges by the end, then keyframing these again to show more of the center at the beginning. We also keyframed the first grid layer scale to increase slightly over time, giving us this. Now we'll hide the shockwave asset and rename this comp Shield Grid and duplicate. In the new comp, hide everything but the shockwave asset and rename this comp to match. In a final duplicate, we'll make only the first matte layer visible and rename again. Next, we're going to drop the shot footage into the new comp, followed by the 3 shield comps, setting them to screen and moving in the timeline for the shield to appear when needed. To match our slightly angled shot, we're going to make all of these layers 3D and create a new camera which will angle until it looks right. To add some slight curve to the shield, we're going to use a bulge effect, keyframing most of the values to change as the shield expands. An optics compensation effect can also add a bit more curve. But now copy and paste these to each comp layer. And while this was shot nice and smooth on the Ronin 4D, there still is some motion that the shield is going to need to track to. So we'll create a null layer and do a 2D track of our footage and apply that to the null. Now we'll duplicate this and the camera 3 times, link each shield comp to one of these nulls, select them with a camera, and pre-compose each as a tracked version. And now we have the shockwave, the grid, and the matte individual again, but all angled and tracked. Next, we're going to hide these for now, and with a new adjustment layer, we'll add the compound blur effect, selecting the grid comp as the layer and increasing the blur, which will only affect certain areas depending on the luminance of the layer being used, giving a frosted glass type of effect here. The only issue is, as the effect goes near the edges of the frame, it blurs the alpha. So to fix that, just drop in a motion tile effect placed before the compound blur, check mirror edges, expanding the output height and width, and unchecking stretch map to fit. Next, we'll add in Red Giant's chromatic displacement plugin, again choosing the grid comp as the layer and changing amount and softness until we're happy, giving us this. To soften the edges and give a motion blur look, we can set both of these to use layer effects and masks, and on the grid comp layer, we'll add a CC radial blur, changing to straight zoom and increasing the values. You can get some interesting looks going through these, but we wanted to keep it subtle, so we'll keyframe the amount to lessen over time just to soften the sharpness we were getting before. Now with a duplicate of the grid comp placed above the displacement, we'll enable visibility, set the blending mode to overlay, and lower the opacity until we get this slight hint of a highlight. Now duplicate the adjustment layer and move it below the first one. On this, we're going to lower the compound blur effect and choose the shockwave comp as the layer instead. Same for the displacement layer before changing some of the values to give us a soft, wide ripple. Now we'll duplicate this adjustment layer again, move it above the top grid comp, and change the blur value as well as the displacement setting to give us a closer, more defined ripple as well. Now move the shockwave comp to the top, make it visible, and to add color, we're going to use Video Copilot's free color vibrance effect. As is common for this sort of effect, we have a greenish look here, so we'll choose a green before lowering the vibrance value. Then with the curves effect, we're going to add a bit of contrast, then Red Giant's optical glow, changing these settings to get a soft wash of glow before Red Giant's RGB separation effect, just to add some accents of color. And we also keyframe the layer opacity to fade on and off a bit rather than staying 100% throughout. Then, with a new adjustment layer placed above the footage, we'll use a curves to lift the shadows and add a green color, then a fast box blur with boosted radius, and set this layer to use matte comp as the alpha, keeping it visible only inside the shield. We then lowered opacity slightly and keyframed it to decrease over time. We also added another adjustment layer beneath this, then shifting the color more green and animating opacity to increase as the shield expands, giving us this. As she passes the poster here, we need to put the shield reflection in, and with this dark environment, we can kind of get away with just doing the shockwave, so we'll create a new solid and keyframe a feathered mask to move with the poster. Now duplicate the shockwave comp as well as the layer and swap it out with the new one. Inside this comp, we're going to paste the poster solid, reposition, scale, and rotate the shockwave for the reflection, lower opacity, and use the rotoed poster solid as an alpha matte. Now make sure to move below the displacement layers, and to finish, we made her eyes black and added some lens effects and real smart motion blur as a final touch, giving us this final shot. And there you have it, a sci-fi force field to protect you from Justin with a toy AK-47, which also, this gun does not look good up close at all, but somehow totally works within these shots. You gotta love it. But overall, with production on shots like these, I really do adore being able to stay minimal and mobile. The more I can be wireless and just go battery powered with everything, the happier I am. But it really does take powerful and reliable batteries like these from Smallrig. So if you are looking for some new batteries, I definitely recommend giving these a closer look, which we have links for in the notes below, and links for everything else we talked about are below as well. And until next time, don't forget to write, shoot, edit, repeat.